Okay.
That's fine with me.
So let's get officially started. Introduce yourself, let people know where they can find you, and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, well, my name is Jill Urbane, and I am a master's level social worker and an early childhood interventionist. I've been working with families for about 30 years, and the last 25 of those, I've been working as an early childhood interventionist with infants, toddlers, and preschoolers with developmental delays, providing services in the home to help parents better understand their children and help them meet their developmental milestones. So a lot of what I've been talking about with parents is language and communication, because that's big with young kids, but a lot of it is about behavior and parenting as well. And I started a YouTube channel where you can find me, and my handle there is @the_mentor_mom_blog. And I've posted all sorts of information on development and parenting and all of the things that are so challenging for parents in those first couple of years.
So take us from the very beginning. How did you officially get started in this area? Because I know a lot of people want to have children. Children are a beautiful creation, and they're kind of like inspired to be it. But I'm always curious about the journey of the person who wants to help others with parents. So tell us how you got started in this and what was the genesis and the reason why.
Well, it's really quite an interesting story because working with children and parents was never on my radar at all. I actually didn't think I would ever become a mom myself, but I got into the field of social work thinking that I wanted to work in mental health. So I worked in a psychiatric facility for a while. And then from there, I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but I ended up working for the Department of Corrections in my state. And in that capacity as a prison counselor, I was working with young men. Most of them were between the ages of like 14 and 21 that were maximum security prisoners. And I think I was really just kind of struck in working with them on how so many of them had a history of neglect or abuse, and they were so bright. And it was just kind of heartbreaking to see these young men being incarcerated for the rest of their lives. And I thought, gosh, maybe there's something I can do to keep kids from ending up here. So from there, I ended up as a children's protective services worker for about 5 years. And that's where I really fell in love with being in families' homes, because when you're in somebody's home, that is real. There's no covering anything up. That the pain is there, the feelings, the emotions. You really see their experience. And that's kind of where I fell in love with working with families. They were in crisis. And even though I was there as investigating abuse and neglect, these were families who had histories of trauma, who had faced their own challenges as parents growing up, and were doing the best they could with their kids, but they just didn't have a lot of tools in their toolbox. And so from there, I ended up, that's about the time that I had my first. I've got 2 kids. They're both adults now, and they still live at home, but that's a topic for a different day. But that's about the time that I had my first child. And for me, it was not an easy journey. My first was very, very challenging for me. And I decided I didn't want to work in CPS anymore because it was so emotionally draining. And I felt like I really wasn't able to be there for my family because I was so worried about all of the other families and kids. So I had this opportunity come up to work for an early intervention program, which I had no experience with. And once I got in there, I was just hooked, 100% hooked, working with these families with young kids, because the journey they were going through was very similar to the journey I was going through with my own kids at the time.
I know a lot of boys, well, I shouldn't say they're boys, but I know a lot of men, when they describe how they're still at home, and you made that kind of joke, that's a topic for another day, right? They will say something along the lines is that I don't live with my mother, it's joint with my mother.
Well, and that is just kind of a whole different topic there, right? Like what young adults are facing in trying to get out and purchase homes and have enough income to do all the things that we kind of took for granted, when we were their age. The economy and all of that is just very, very different. It's a real challenge for young adults to go out and have the same kind of lifestyle that we had at that age.
It definitely is different, right? Because when we purchase a house, I don't know how long you've had your house, but I've had mine probably about 14 years now. And I remember what I paid for it back then, it's
Right.
almost like tripled. I remember a house going for 2.2 million in my
Oh,
neighborhood.
that's crazy.
And I remember, and I'm going to age myself, ladies and gentlemen. I remember a show called MTV Cribs. I remember Million Dollar Home used to have like a pool, a basketball court, a theater, a club, a Starbucks. You
Right.
didn't have to leave the front porch,
Right. Right.
right?
It was its own city.
It was always, yeah, it was a city within your four walls. But these days it's a lot more difficult for the children because they're still trying to figure it out in a world that I feel is changing a lot faster than maybe
Hmm.
when you and I, like I'm in my 30s and I still remember vaguely the analog age where it's like my grandmother who raised me, she had a VCR,
Yeah.
right? There wasn't the internet. I remember going to, and I'm going to make sure I look young here. I remember going to the museum and seeing a rotary phone. Right?
I always like
But
to tell my
now,
kids that I was my parents' remote control. We were the ones turning the channels and adjusting the rabbit ears. That's how old I am.
exactly. You hit the side of it, make sure the picture came in right, all that good stuff, right?
Right, right.
But now we're trying to help kids figure it out by saying that, hey, some of the things that maybe we kind of chuckle about today wasn't necessarily the best when we were growing up. But to your point, the parents were doing the best that they could with the knowledge that they had because it
Hmm.
wasn't as resourceful as it is now. Do you find sometimes that there's that struggle with parents trying to say that, hey, the way that I was raised isn't necessarily the way that I should be raising my children?
Absolutely. And I really feel like, you know, having done this for as many years as I have, I've seen the change in parenting and what parents nowadays are facing compared to what like I was facing when my kids were younger. And there are good things and then there are bad things. Like one of the things that I'm highly encouraged about with this progress in parenting that I'm seeing is that parents are really understanding the importance of addressing their child's social emotional growth, recognizing their feelings, acknowledging that. So I find that really, really encouraging. What I see so often with parents though is trying to figure out, like, if I grew up in a household where there was physical discipline, or my parents did a lot of yelling, or there was no talking back or expressing your feelings. What the parent said was the written rule, and that's the way it is, and you just have to kind of suck it up and accept it. And a parent who's like, I don't want to raise my child that way, they're I think they're struggling to find that middle ground where you can acknowledge your child's feelings and encourage their social emotional development and growth, but you can still also have firm limits, because that's a really, really important part. I always tell parents that the world is going to say no far more often than it's going to say yes to our kids. And it's really important for us at a really young age and consistently throughout the course of their lives to help them get used to that concept and prepare for that concept, because that's what creates resiliency. And that is the biggest indicator of success as adults.
I found that the physical discipline boundary was something that I don't know if it was out of respect that you had it right. I think it was like more of a fear that you didn't want to do this because you knew this was the consequence. But one thing that I will add to that is it clearly defined the boundary. You knew that if you did this, this was basically a guarantee to happen. If it was like a slap on the hand or the belt, which is famous, the spoon, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
case is, right? Now we tend to try to set that boundary verbally,
Mm-hmm.
right? We say, don't do this because something may happen. And unfortunately, in my experience, I find that human beings, they pay more attention if they can visualize it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we know that if someone shoots a gun at you, you may die.
Right. Right.
Right? But if we were to communicate, if you shoot the gun at someone, something might happen. So if you don't know what that something is, some people may test that limit because there are those types of people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find when you're helping with these young children who have all this energy, who are still trying to figure it out, who may not truly understand the why in the parents' instructions? Do you find that the boundaries are sometimes being tested, or maybe they're not as firmly created by the parents?
Well, boundaries being tested by young kids is just a normal part of development. That's their job, right? They're trying to figure out what are the rules of the world, and they always are going to test us as parents and caretakers far more than they're going to test anybody else in the outside world, because no matter what they say or do, we aren't going to love them any less. So that's why we get some of their ugliest behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to like being around them while they're doing that necessarily, but that is a normal part of development. They're just trying to figure out the A's and B's. If I do A, am I going to get B every single time? And this is where kind of the train goes off the track for parents, is the consistency. They lack the consistency. And if kids are going to get B sometimes, and sometimes I get an F, and sometimes I get D, they're going to continue to test until they have figured out, especially young children, when they finally figured out that every time I do A, I'm going to get B. Then they can close this loop that's developing, a neural pathway that's developing in the brain that can say, okay, I'm good. I figured it out. No matter how many times I do this with my parent, this is always going to be the response. So I'm going to make the decision that it doesn't work for me anymore, and I'm going to move on to the next thing to test my parent on.
If I brought D's home, I think I would be homeless. I don't know what would happen if I brought an F home. Right?
Exactly. I know. Well, and one big thing that I always like to go over with parents is to really understand like different parenting styles and their outcomes, right? So we don't want to be the helicopter parent who's doing everything for our kids and letting them kind of walk all over us and giving them everything they want, because then they grow up into an adult and they think that that's what their experience is going to be. And boy, that is not their experience as an adult. I have to pay my own bills. I have to figure out, I have to go to work when I don't want to go to work. We also don't want to be the drill sergeant parent who's telling our kids, you need to do this, you need to do that, you better take care of this, because at some point in time, we're not going to be there anymore to tell them what to do. Both of those parenting styles, research has shown, lead to lower self-esteem, an increase in mental illness and mental health issues as adults, anxiety, depression, because both of those styles send the message that you can't handle life on your own. You either need me to do it for you all the time as a helicopter parent, or you need me to tell you what to do. So we're actually undermining their self-confidence. So what we really want to do is be a consultant parent. We want to provide them with feedback. We want to have firm and healthy boundaries for ourselves. Like, I don't hang out with kids that scream at me. You can go on up to your room and do that. Come on down when you're all done with that. I'm happy to talk to you in a calm voice, like I'm talking to you right now. So the consultant parent's going to let them make the mistakes, give them natural consequences, and demonstrate good boundaries, because then kids can learn to develop their own internal dialogue where they're thinking, boy, the last time I said that to my mom, it didn't work out so well for me. I don't think I want to talk to her that way again because it doesn't work to get me what I want.
When I think of a consultant parent, I think of you treating the child like an adult in a way, right? Where you're, just based on the example you've given, where if I'm having a conversation with you and there's a behavior that you're doing that I don't appreciate or I don't like, we would have that conversation and say, hey, I didn't like the way you approached me, and have that type of conversation. Maybe when you're ready to have a better conversation, you and I can continue further. Would that be an accurate example of a consultative parent?
That's a perfect example. And here's the big bonus in responding that way to our kids, is that we're modeling how we take care of ourselves. Like, I'm not going to interact with a kid who's being disrespectful to me. We're not going to say it that way. You can't talk to me that way, right? Because then that's just I can't. Well, yes, I can. But what you're doing is you're modeling how you take care of yourself. Like, I don't hang out with kids that are hitting. I don't hang out with kids that are, yelling at me. They then internalize that, right? But because we're doing it, our responses are always in a calm and assertive voice, right? Using I statements, like you were using an I statement there. I would be more than happy to when you this, right? Instead of you, because when we use the yous, people get defensive, right? So when we're modeling that kind of communication style and parenting style for our kids, they're internalizing that. So when they next time are hanging out at school with a peer that's maybe coming off a little bit too aggressive or too bossy or being disrespectful, they know this is not how I shouldn't be interacting with people that are interacting with me in this manner. So I need to have a good boundary. And I know what that good boundary is because I see it consistently from my parent.
For those who are watching on Facebook, YouTube, and my social media, please continue to follow along, subscribe, and like and share the video for more fantastic interviews with my new best friend, Jill. And we